Whoops. Hey, everybody. Hey, how you doing out there? Great to see all y'all. Hey, we got a good one for you today. So, we are doing a fun topic, a very special, dear topic for me today. We're going to be talking about the 90s, Grand Royal Magazine, and the whole ethos and culture of the 90s that Grand Royal Magazine represented. Great time period, and we got a lot to cover today. But first, I want to say thank you to all you out there in Chatland. And I just want to briefly introduce myself since this is a new topic that I'm covering. I might be reaching a new audience. So I just want to briefly say hello to anybody who's new to the channel and just briefly say who I am. My name is Manny. Thank you so much for coming in today. And for the last 2 years, I've been conducting an online investigation into the Son of Sam murders. Yes, you heard me correctly. The Son of Sam murders. And why would I need to do that? Well, because, quite frankly, the Son of Sam murders needed to be cleaned up. For the last 45 years, people have been believing this myth about cult involvement. And actually, I started out my investigation believing that as well. And it was an amazing moment in time. It's over now. I have retired from that particular story. And my hope now is to use this channel as as a vehicle for other things that I'm interested in. And also, I'll finally get to use this useless sociology degree that I got when? Well, way back in the 90s. So this is going to be a great topic. So real quick, just want to say that we're going to get dense today. We're going to get in depth, and we are taking it to the highest level possible. And so, welcome everybody out there. So, let's just get started. We got quite a lot to do today. And I just want to let everyone know that there's a call in link. If you want to call in and tell us your stories of the 90s, your experiences, any remembrances you may have, that's fine. The live call in link is of course, in the description. And if you call in, just understand that it may take me a while to get to you, and also to pay attention to me announcing that you'll be on, because you need to turn off your YouTube and pay attention to the studio that you'll be in. Otherwise, there's a pretty decent delay and it'll just look very awkward. And as those who know me know, I like to run a tight ship. Speaking of that, let's get right to the material, guys. We got a lot to do. So, of course, we are talking about Grand Royal Magazine and the ethos of the 90s. So, the 90s, of course, amazing time period in American history, one which I do not believe will ever be repeated. While we were living them, I think a lot of us of that age group, I was born in 1973, okay, and I'll prove it in a little while. I think a lot of us, whilst living during that period, remember it as knew during the time period that we were living in a magical moment. And we'll get into all of that. We'll get into why the 90s ruled. And of course, the whole topic today of tying it into this great magazine called Grand Royal came to me because I just was visiting my parents the other day and I realized that in their bookcase, they have all of these Grand Royal magazines. No, my parents were not that cool. My parents were definitely born in the 30s and 40s. And so they, of course, are members of the silent generation, the greatest generation, or what, no, the silent generation. And as such, they just aren't cool. They didn't know about Grand Royal Magazine in the 90s. But we have these belong to my sister. And we've had them since she bought them brand new back in the 90s. She has 5 issues of them. There was actually 6 of them, which we'll see. And I was going through these after almost 30 years of not having seen them. I remember being obsessed with these when they came out. So I do remember quite a lot of the articles that were in there. But looking at it 30 years on, with everything that's happened to us as a society in the last 30 years, it really made me realize that these magazines, perhaps more than any other piece of pop art and cultural artifacts of the 90s, represented the ethos of that decade, in my opinion, the most. Now, you may disagree. You may be coming at it from a different sociological perspective, a different cultural, anthropological perspective. And hey, that's fine. We want to see your video as well. Okay. We're all about positivity here. But for me, being a musician back then, being a middle class kid of the 90s. The Beastie Boys really defined that generation for me and so many others. And so I figured that it would be a good opportunity to show you some articles in here and just basically discuss things. And of course, this also is a love letter, a paean to my generation, Generation X. Okay. We are often maligned, ignored quite often. And quite frankly, we did not live up to our potential. Yes, I said it. Okay. So I'm reminded, of course, of a lyrics of a band that I was in the early 2000s that really captured that very much, very, very well. And this was a band called Driver. You will never find us online. We didn't have any online presence, but this was a great band that I was in, probably one of my favorites. And of course, we had a song about how, well, everything was going to come crashing down at some point soon. And boy, did it happen. And of course, micromanaged by bureaucracies, psychos damage my philosophies. Possibly that may be why I'm lethargic. Generation X, we've been a target, caught in a state of hypocrisy. But there's nothing one man can do. We must unite to fight these wicked suits and ties before they enterprise, cover up their mistakes with propaganda games and devil lies. When is it going to all stop, y'all? And of course, that's kind of how I really feel. And this captures it perfectly for me. And so, Generation X, we've got a lot to answer for. But boy, did we have a lot of fun back then. So, of course, proving that I'm of a certain age, I just wanted to put it out there. Um, this is my fifth grade class, and you can clearly see a young Manny right here with, of course, rocking that 80s, that mid 80s. Actually, this was 80, 83, 84, right? That mid 80s look. I had my braces, of course. And I guess I was a short kid, actually, looking at it because I was right next to the teacher, and everybody, even the girls, are taller than me. What the hell? But interestingly enough, this cat up here, I'm going to be doing a series of shows on starting next week. This is Nikolai Aman. He was actually convicted of a murder in our neighborhood, Riverdale, in the Bronx, of a socialite named Alfred Hunt Howell. So I'm going to be starting a series next weekend, which I'm very much looking forward to. And of course, Rachel Goldstein, Barbara Scapinelli, and Eddie Martinez. I'll never forget. Second grade, end of second grade, we all went down to the woods and played Truth or Dare. And yes, these were the first two girls that I ever made out with. Well, because because we were dared to. But those were the kind of fun things we were up to. Of course, my girl Martha Washington, Dana Bernstein, Barbara Keller, Liza Irizarry was one of my first crushes. Actually, not one of my first crushes, but I had a major crush on her right here. Greg DeMamos, who's now a life coach, famous life coach down in Washington, D.C. Very interesting guy. He became a music manager for a while. And I remember in the 90s, he gives me a call and he says, "Hey, Manny, I'm managing Beck. Do you want to have an audition on drums for Beck?" Right. And Beck had this stupid song called "I'm a Loser." I thought he was a loser. I was like, this guy sucks. And, didn't realize it was an opportunity being thrown my way. I was all arrogant back then. Still am in many ways, but that's a whole other story. And I remember saying to Greg, "Sure, what do I got to do?" "Well, first thing you need to do is sit down with," oh, no, I'm sorry. It wasn't Beck. It was Moby. Moby. That's who it was. It was Moby. "You have to sit down with him and do an interview, and he wants to find out your politics." And I said, "Politics? I'm a drummer. F this guy." So I screwed up that royally. And I later interacted with Greg many years later in 2003 when I was playing for a band called Northern State, a rock band that he was at one of our record release parties. So always a good guy, liked them a lot. So yeah, just proving that I'm smack dab in the middle of Gen X, born in 1973. And honestly, I am so happy that I grew up in this time period, because as we're going to talk about, the 90s were fantastic. In fact, why objectively the 90s were the greatest of decades. Okay, before we get into so Lydia knows what's up, right? Moby, Mr. Self-Important. So so we're going to get into a lot of these articles, don't worry guys, but I want to talk about the decade in which this magazine flourished because it really was of its time. Of course, it couldn't happen now given the internet, but also more importantly, given well, where we are as a culture, as a people. And I'm going to do a lot of comparisons between then and now. Of course, America was booming back then. Okay. It might not have felt it for some people, but objectively, the 90s were remembered as a time of strong economic growth, steady job creation, low inflation, rising productivity, economic boom, and a surging stock market that resulted from a combination of rapid technological changes and sound central monetary policy. Sounds really like a fantasy of a bygone age. And it really is. I mean, look here. I just took this article today, 2022. 9 million millennials moved back in with their parents this year. Okay, this would have been unheard of to my generation. To Generation X, to move to get out of your parents' house was like the biggest deal. Okay. And to never move back, it was considered an absolute shame to ever have to go back to your parents' house. And now we're seeing 9 million millennials moving back. And the reason why is because, quite frankly, they can't afford to live anymore. That was another thing. You know, it's funny because in the 90s, I remember seeing old Village Voice newspapers, and I would look in the old classifieds, and I'm talking about Village Voices from the 60s, right, early 70s, and you look at rents in Soho, which by the 90s, which was of course an incredibly expensive area, but you'd see huge lofts going for like $75 a month. And I would say, no wonder all y'all out there could, like, because I was talking to my boss at that point. I was like, no wonder you guys could flourish. You guys are paying nothing for rent. This precipitated a boom in creativity and art. All these people moving to New York City, this amazing ferment. Of course, that ferment turned into a rot in the 2000s with the advent of the hipster generation, Williamsburg, and the absolute destruction of all art. And now it's all corporatized, right? To the extent that it exists at all. The simple fact is New York has been, of course, destroyed by the last 2 years, the lockdowns, the concomitant human wreckage that occurred because we were all so propagandized, right, by these devil lies. Generation X, you got a lot to answer for. You knew the difference. You knew what was up. You knew how we were being manipulated, lied to. But yet so many of us joined in and later became the Karens that ended up, coming out and saying, "Where's your mask? Where's your mask?" Okay? So not cool at all. So, of course, the Cold War was over. A lot of people don't realize because we live now in an age of constant tension, but the 90s had a very chill vibe to them. I often say the 80s, which was another great decade. The 80s lasted until about 1998. And of course, this here captures it perfectly. The 90s were an exuberant interlude between the Cold War and September 11th. Perfectly stated. The simple fact is America was dominant. We didn't have any enemies that mattered. Russia, the great enemy of my generation, right? I remember in the 80s, The Day After, right? Red Dawn, all Rambo, Commando, all of these great movies that totally propagandized us against Russia. Now, that isn't to say that that those were real. It was total propaganda. I have nothing up against Russia whatsoever. But this country had been decimated. Of course, we didn't realize it then, but laid waste by the very same forces that are now destroying our nation. These were great times because we just had no external enemy. Americans partied in the 90s. Okay. And we really felt like we were it. We were the top dog, and we were. Okay. Everybody wanted to come here. And of course, we still had a viable national culture based on essentially libertarian principles. And at the same time, life was lived locally. So this is important to understand because ever since 2001, when the Democrats and the Republicans united to form the Uniparty, right, that loves war, surveillance, constant invasion in our lives, the biosecurity state, cashless society, all these devils are in on it together, the left and the right, okay, of the corporate wing. But back then, the ethos was essentially libertarian. Okay. I'm a product of that. I consider myself a liberal of the 90s. I still consider myself that. And the reason, of course, is because we believed in freedom, okay, the principles of freedom. Having we weren't anti-police, but we didn't want them in our lives. We didn't want all this constant surveillance. It was a anathema to us. We were against war, all right? Things that are absolutely unheard of now to the modern corporate state. Okay, and at the same time, life was lived locally. And that kind of goes in with my next thing, that we were an analog people in the 90s with just enough digital tech. Okay. Now, this is incredibly important. If you look at this old ass computer here, this was what we had back then. I remember like the first time I ever saw the internet was about 1995 or 6. My friend Andrew had it. It was America Online or CompuServe or one of those things. And everything looked like the most old school message boards you can imagine. Amazon.com had just come out, but it was selling books, and nobody thought that this was even a good idea at the time. But the point is that we were an analog people still. We were still living before this time period when this stuff came to dominate all our lives like it does now. Okay. I'm talking to you because my life is dominated by all this digital tech. It's almost impossible now to live an analog life. And if you do, you are looked at like you're absolutely insane. But not only was it analog tech with computers, but it was analog tech with all the great people still wrote, people still used typewriters, people still used old synthesizers back then. Actually, we're going to look at some interesting articles about the old synthesizers from the 70s that made a big resurgence in the 90s. And I really cry out for those time periods because people nowadays, especially the youth, and yeah, I know I'm sounding old and I know I'm sounding get off my lawn, but there's something essential about life that a lot of the youth are missing now, which is just the ability to do nothing, okay? Or the ability to pick up a magazine and read it. Okay. These magazines that we're going to talk about in a little bit were like the most craziest internet searches that you could ever go on. And it was all within these pages, and you could hold it and touch it and in fact smell it. Right. And you could take your time with these articles and you could learn from them. It wasn't there's there's something very important about that. And I'm not saying we have to go back to that, although we do, and we will eventually. Remember, all this is temporary, as the Zen masters say. Nothing is permanent. So eventually there'll be no electricity to run this stuff anymore, and it'll all go away. Okay. But there was something about that time. It was the perfect mixture of analog and digital. All right. So we're doing good. Yep. Esco Aquarian talks about it was before the race war program. Exactly. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. Well, right here, more reasons the 90s ruled. We weren't living in the age of manufactured mass crisis, or the better way to put that is we weren't yet aware as a nation, right, of the manufactured mass crises that were taking place. People still lived their lives locally, okay? We had a viable national culture. People were still into the top 10 song on Casey Kasem's, even into the early 90s, right? But what I'm talking about here is the age of manufactured mass crisis. Of course, it really did start in the 90s, although we didn't realize it. The incident that woke me up actually occurred in 1996. It was the Oklahoma City bombing. When I realized, at first I bought it lock, stock, and barrel. But just as an example of how great the 90s were, we had this book company called Loom Panics. Loom Panics was amazing. It was a mail order book company where you could get the Anarchist Cookbook, all the writings of James Mason, William Pierce of the National Socialist, National Alliance. And now I'm not particularly into that, but the point is we read all of this material back then. It didn't offend us. We were able to read it, kind of laugh, put it away, but in some cases be influenced by it as well. And I realized at that point that, boy, this government is starting a war against us. And so I became essentially a hardcore libertarian at that moment, even though I retained all of my liberal beliefs. And also Giuliani, there's this, the September criminal came into our lives in the 90s. And although New York did get better, it did become very fascistic with police state tactics, roadblocks everywhere. So that stuff did start, but again, it wasn't dominating our lives like it later did. And of course, Simone Nyman says the something very, very true. Everything changed when the towers came down. You could make the argument that the 80s lasted until September 11th, 2001. And of course, after that, we have been living in this state dominated by manufactured mass crises. It's never ended. Okay. And unless we wake up, it's never going to end. And I really truly believe that it's Generation X that needs to do this. The millennials are dead. Forget them. Okay. They're gone. Gen X, well, they were raised and born by, I'm sorry, Gen Z, they were raised and born by Gen X. So there's a possibility there. I have some hope for Gen Z. But right now, the only viable generations that are going to actually lead us to the promised land, if we're going to get there, is Gen X and Gen Z. And I'm losing hope every day because boy, did we drink the Kool-Aid as a Gen X as a society. Okay. And of course, in the 90s, the nuclear family was still relatively intact. Yes, the New World Order and these evil demons were starting their attack on the nuclear family, but yet there was still a viable family culture in America. And more importantly, members of the Depression era and World War II era were still vital. They were still our grandparents. They were still imparting a lot of knowledge and wisdom on us. And this is incredibly important because these people, the Depression era people and the World War II era people, were no joke. They knew the value of hard work. They knew the value of loyalty. They knew the value of honesty. They really taught our generation a lot. We were born not from the baby boomers. Okay. The millennials were born by the baby boomers. And that's one of the reasons the millennials, and now I'm just speaking generally here, why millennials suck. Okay. They're the ones that are instituting all this crap that we have to deal with, especially in our corporations, our HR departments. Okay. But the generation, the silent generation, the Depression era generation, those people were amazing and they were still vital and influential. And of course, music and artistic expression reached a certain height because of the cross fertilization that thrived in those years. And of course, I could speak forever, but really, enter Grand Royal Magazine. Cross fertilization really did, I mean, so amazingly exemplified in these magazines, as we're going to see. Well, let's just get into it. Well, Grand Royal Magazine was a very short-lived artistic endeavor, creative endeavor, journalistic endeavor by these three gentlemen right here. And these three gentlemen, of course, are the Beastie Boys, who by the 1994 came out with, in my opinion, their most amazing album ever called Check Your Head. And the reason why was because these people, these amazing musicians and artists, were living this cross fertilization dream. They were New Yorkers now living in LA. They had started to incorporate live instruments into their rap. They were infusing elements of hardcore, of Latin jazz, of funk, of pop, of African music, of 70s disco, right? And so they were very interesting people, and we owe these guys a debt of gratitude, not only for the music that they made, but in my opinion, more importantly, the written legacy they left behind in these magazines. These magazines, if you study them like I've studied them, can be almost a life guide to you guys. And we're going to look at some amazing articles. So, but first, of course, there was only 6 issues of this magazine printed, and then apparently it went on to online. But I found this article that I wanted to share with you because it actually talks about it better than I ever could. So this is from The Atlantic, right? A very highbrow magazine. But remembering Grand Royal, the Beastie Boys' brief, brilliant magazine. Okay. Adam Yauch will be remembered first and foremost for his genre-altering music career, but the artist better known as MCA did much more than that. In between and sometimes overlapping with his Beastie Boys gigs, Yauch was a filmmaker, an outspoken activist with the Free Tibet movement, playful letter writer to the New York Times, and from 1993 to 1997, a magazine publisher. Along with his bandmates, Ad Rock and Mike D, Yauch helped create 6 issues of Grand Royal, a glossy response to the zine culture that came to define part of Generation X. And zine culture would make a great topic for someone out there besides me. Okay. Grand Royal wasn't the smoothest running magazine. According to fan site Beastie Mania, the second issue hit newsstands an entire year late. It was well intentioned, though. We didn't sit down and think, hey, let's make a magazine, Mike D told Select Magazine in 1997. It was more pathetic than that. We had all of these people writing to us about the band, and we weren't getting back. We had this simple ambition of a newsletter. But then we saw a couple other bands, fanzines, and they were like, this is what the band is up to, and this is what they'll be doing. We were like, no way. So we made it into a proper magazine. The band printed only 7,500 copies of that first issue, but circulation quickly grew to the tens of thousands. The magazine was a mix of music, culture, and random things the Beastie Boys thought was cool, like Kung Fu, Demolition Derby, and Moog synthesizers. It was a chaotic endeavor, and after cycling through several editors, Grand Royal went to an online-only format in 1997. Copies are pretty available on eBay, but they are not cheap. It's tough to find articles from Grand Royal, but you might like this Q&A with clothing manufacturer Ben Davis, or this interview with Ted Nugent, Madman. Adam Yauch's name makes it onto the cover of the first issue. Here's an interview he did with the Dalai Lama. And even though it was a year behind schedule, the second issue does sport a pretty impressive cover. Let me show you that cover right here. That cover is this one right here, which this is, in my opinion, probably the best. Sorry. This is the in my opinion, the best of the best. I love this issue. And we're going to see some articles from that today. Okay. Then things got a little psychedelic for Grand Royals, issues 3 and 4. The final issues look more like album covers, like magazines. As with so many Beastie Boy ventures, Grand Royal came to define a certain 90s era cool. And we couldn't imagine a current group that could pull off anything like it. So, of course, I'm not a big fan of The Atlantic, but I have to say that that is a very concise and well-written article and really captures it perfectly, which is why I wanted to talk about it, to read it to you guys. So, of course, here's issue 1, which I do not have. And these are scans of the covers that I took. I took these scans, so they're kind of like original, one removed from the original. And of course, we're going to look at some of these articles, but look at some of these. Was Timothy Leary a CIA agent? Okay, whatever happened to Charles Wright, who I have no idea who it is? The history of the mullet, right? Ted Nugent's amazing interview, which we're going to listen to excerpts of today. Dolomite and Queen Bee, Bill Clinton's dog, and all sorts of fun stuff like that. Of course, issue 3 then was the Moog issue, Switched on Moog, which had actually incredibly scholarly articles about the history of the synthesizer. And it's funny because there's so many dweebs nowadays who are like analog synthesists, right? And they're and all of these old analog synthesizers are still making comebacks to this day, and people want to own them and use them. But back in the 90s, people actually used them creatively and made music. Now it's all about making YouTube videos to show off your latest piece of gear that you're just making bloops and bleeps with, and there's no music being made. Okay, now I could be very wrong about that, and I'm sure that there's amazing stuff happening out there musically. But music just doesn't seem as important to the culture as it was back in the 90s. And of course, the Grand Royal magazine exemplified that perfectly because it mixed the music with clothing, with movies, with demolition derbies, with all sorts of amazing articles in this incredible stew called these Grand Royal magazines. This is issue number 4, okay, which talked about all sorts of stuff, turntables, the history of turntables, Lenny and Squiggy articles, Mike Watt's knees, which is an incredibly funny article. We'll look at that a little bit more today. And issue 5, of course, is beats, booty, and bass. And of course, now you'd get canceled for something like this, right? But this is again showing you how amazing the 90s were. We were classical liberals, libertarian ethoses. We didn't get offended. No one got offended back then. Actually, there was the beginnings of that happening on college campuses, and I saw it in college in 1991. But we still considered those people to be the dweebiest losers around. Now those people have taken over every HR department and every institution that there is, and we see the results. Our culture is moribund, dead, lifeless. It's complete crap out there. What little culture remains. And of course, issue 6, which was the final issue, which had tons and tons of amazing articles in it, but it was dedicated to the demolition derby, something that maybe happens now in America. I'm not quite sure. But remember, we were an analog people then with just a little bit of digital tech. The 80s lasted into the 90s. And, the demolition derby was an amazing artifact of those years. So let's take a look at, well, some of the tables of contents of this. This is the table of content of this one right here, the one with Lee Scratch Perry on it. And like I said before, it's like the most insane internet search that you'd ever do. It would be an internet search of a very interesting, eclectic person. Okay, restaurateur Russell Simmons, right? Ultimate Fighting Champ Royce Gracie, Ricky Powell premieres his all new Snaps and recollects his day as a substitute teacher, right? So you learn new snaps in there. And for those who don't remember, snaps was like something we did back then. You'd snap on someone, you'd snap on their mother, you'd snap on their generation, all that kind of stuff. The history of the mullet, right? Murder Can Be Fun. The Short Unhappy Life of Charles Guiteau, the visionary who shot President James A. Garfield in 1881, right? A super duper 24-page complete Lee Perry primer. And Lee Perry was this guy on the cover, Lee Scratch Perry, who was an amazing reggae and ska producer and all that kind of stuff, dub bass, dub reggae. And I wasn't particularly into that music, but I read every word of that article because it was just an interesting person. And it had these amazing pictures in there as well. So again, that's part of the cultural ferment back then. I, as a progressive rock fan, a metalhead, was reading about Lee Scratch Perry, and it taught me a thing or two about his style of music that I never would have been not subjected to, exposed to. Bad Trip. You can't spell acid without CIA, right? We're gonna look at this article about how Timothy Leary, was he a CIA agent, and all this kind of fun stuff. So these magazines really are worth your time to go out and seek if you can find them. I am not going to be reprinting any of these articles outside of this live stream today. Well, one, because I don't want to break any copyright laws, but also part of the ethos of the 90s was going out and searching for things. There wasn't anything online for us to just get at our fingertips. You actually had to go and look for things. And so because I'm talking about the ethos of the 90s, if you want these articles, you're going to have to put a little bit of work into it. Okay, guys? That's just the long and short of it. That's the beauty of these things. So let's look at some short examples of Grand Royal's greatness. So here's just an interesting thing. I didn't realize that Adam Horovitz was the son of a wonderful playwright, Israel Horovitz. Yeah, in fact, the Beastie Boys were actually seemingly children of fairly high wealth and privilege, or at least privilege. I know that Mike D's mother was a famous art collector, lived in a huge penthouse on the Upper West Side, and we're not saying anything negative about that. But these were interesting cats who were educated, who were cultured, who grew up in really an amazing milieu themselves, filled with artists and musicians and writers and poets. And it had intellectuals, and it had a lot of effect on them. And so they weren't just these dumb rappers as they portrayed themselves to be on their first album. They were actually incredibly smart. And one of the reasons why, of course, that only the Beastie Boys and the intellectual minds that they had could have put out magazines this great. So let's look at some examples of this. So of course, my favorite, the Dolomite articles. Dolomite was the bomb. Okay. I don't know who, if anybody here remembers black exploitation movies from the 70s. But what happened in the 70s was that all of these movies came out that barely no one saw. And then what happened in the 80s was these things called video rental stores came out. And I remember here in Yonkers, well, I'm in Riverdale in the Bronx, but I used to go to this place called Roberta's up in Yonkers. It was on McLean Avenue. And this was the best video store ever because they had like 100,000 movies and they had a black exploitation section. And so I would go and I would look through there and I would find Dolomite movies. I would find Blackula and all these, The Shaft, and all these great movies with amazing music. Now, let's not kid ourselves. The acting was horrible, the editing was horrible, the storylines made no sense. But actually, that was part of the charm of these amazing movies. So my favorite, of course, was Rudy Ray Moore, the Dolomite. He was the bomb. And apparently the Beastie Boys thought so too, because they had in two separate magazines. They had Busta Rhymes meet Dolomite. Okay. And there was a whole interview between Busta Rhymes of the 90s and Rudy Ray Moore, the guy who played Dolomite. There was a lot of respect. There was a lot of mutual respect between these two. And the interview really shows it. And of course, Hurricane versus the Dolomite. Now, it's interesting because it's since come out that Dolomite was actually a gay dude, right? But in his movies, he always played the hyper masculine black pimp, right? The dude who the dude who was always fighting the white man, the evil white demon that came into their. Actually, these movies were very prescient if you think about it. It was the white government demon always coming into the black community to try to sell guns and drugs to them, which actually was true. Okay, so Rudy Ray Moore, in his own way, was actually doing a lot to improve the cultural knowledge of those who watch these movies, and he did it through entertainment. The bad acting and the editing and the fact that in some scenes you could see the microphones right hanging down, and you could clearly see when there were fight scenes, but like no one would actually get hit. But there was something very special about the Rudy Ray Moore movies, the Dolomite movies, and I highly recommend for those who don't know these movies, who might be seeing this stuff for the first time, a young kid who's just like into 90s retro. The 90s actually in many ways kind of worshiped the 70s. It was this weird thing how we skipped that generation. We all grew up in the 80s, and by the 90s we came of age, right? And so we were remembering all of our old stuff from the 70s. So in that regard, the 90s was very interesting as well. But Rudy Ray Moore, of course, unbelievable. And of course, we have the paintings of Evel Knievel, right? Those of you of a certain age will remember Evel Knievel. Remember, back in those days, we had a national culture. We had national heroes. We had people that we all agreed on were just freaking cool people. And Evel Knievel was definitely one of those. He was he was a motorcycle guy who did all these amazing stunts, and everybody watched kind of hoping that the dude would like fall on his ass, would break every bone in his body. And at some point he got into some major accidents, and that was part of it too. People kind of wanted to see it, but you'd never know that Evel Knievel was an artist as well. And the reason we know that is because the wonderful editors and curators of Grand Royal magazine did an article on the paintings of Evel Knievel. Now, granted, this isn't fine art, okay? But still fun and interesting stuff. Different, eclectic, but not highbrow, right? That's the important thing to understand. None of this stuff was highbrow. It didn't take itself so seriously like they do now. Okay, with all these millennials trying to curate everything. Here's a great article. Bob Mack, who was the editor of Grand Royal, they did a whole series on drummers. Clyde Stubblefield, Jabbo Starks, Al Green, maybe I'm getting Al Green wrong, but all these amazing drummers were in a magazine, and people didn't know these people back then. Remember, these magazines were like obscure internet searches that exposed us to things that we never would have known. We never would have known that the drummer for all the James Brown stuff was Clyde Stubblefield. And if you look at YouTube today, you can see Clyde Stubblefield videos, people still worshiping the guy. The reason why these people became known was because of magazines like Grand Royal exposing these people who, up to that point, were never seen before. But of course, this is Bob Mack's 13 plus 1 drummers who changed my life. And there's some standard people on here, like John Bonham, Ginger Baker, Phil Collins, Bill Bruford, Stuart Copeland, yes, Neil Peart, which we'll talk about in more detail, Buddy Rich, Don Henley. But there was also some obscure drummers, Ray Phillips, never heard of him, Jake Liebert from Can, right? Andy Blink, Master Radio Canaries, the Lampshades, Mike D's on there, right? Chico Hamilton. And of course, a whole bunch of honorable mentions. So what we would do when we saw articles like this is we would seek out these people's music. Okay. This is how we did it back then. We didn't have the internet. We were exposed to people who were curating this stuff in many ways for us. And then telling us which one of these people were the most worthy to look out for. And 99 out of 100 times they were right. But of course, I found the Neil Peart excerpt very interesting, not only because it's brilliantly written, but also because of the sociological import of Neil Peart and Rush and how that changed in the 90s. And we're going to talk about that right now. First, Neil Peart, Rush. Burdened by a bigger reputation, both positive and negative, than the rest of this list combined, Peart remains the paradigm for most paradiddlers, even those that refuse to get past his painfully pat points of view, as presented in his now often predictable but once precocious, for a percussionist, prose poesies. Damn, the alliterations just don't stop, editor. And once you do that, it's impossible not to give pause. Which is why Amory Smith, aka auxiliary Beastie Boy drummer AWOL, wouldn't be caught dead resorting to Peart's patented roller coaster rototom routine, long since rendered ridiculous by rah-rah Rush fans reactionaries. But by the same token, Amory'd give his left nut to sit at the master's feet for a few. In short, Biz Markie has 2 copies of Moving Pictures. Shouldn't you? And of course, Moving Pictures is Rush's really amazing, probably one of their best albums. I personally love Caress of Steel. That puts me in a very small category of Rush fans. But Moving Pictures is definitely up there. Every day I'm playing on my bass. I was a drummer, of course, in those years. But every day I'm playing on my bass something off of Moving Pictures. Why? Because it gets my hands moving. It gets the brain moving. But by the 90s, as you can read here, Rush and Neil Peart, we were completely uncool. And I have a funny story about that, which I'll tell you now. And an interesting story. I was actually a witness to history. We'll get into that. And of course, here's Neil Peart with his this is a poster that I had back in those days that I had framed on my bedroom wall. And of course, you had to send in $3 to Zildjian, and then they would send you this in the mail. It was all done by mail back then. That was one of the most amazing things about those times, is that everything was slow. There wasn't this instant gratification. By the way, if people want to call in, again, I saw that someone didn't know where the link was. It's in the description. And I don't know if Ruby's watching now or if Moet is watching now, but if you want to just throw in those links into the chat, that'd be great too. I'm not going to get to you right away, but please call in. So this was like the most amazing thing to me in the 80s. I got into Rush. Actually, my sister first played me Moving Pictures in 1981 when it came out. I was 8 years old. And I remember very, very very well that first opening bass drum synthesizer hit of Tom Sawyer. And then the vocals came in and it sounded like a woman to me, and I was not into it. I got into Peart later when I first started playing drums in 1986 or so. And at Roberta's Video City, I picked up their video concert, Exit Stage Left, and I never was the same after that, after seeing Limelight. And this dude right here being such a master on the drums. Now, little did I know that Billy Cobham in 1971 with the Mahavishnu Orchestra had already totally destroyed everything this guy Peart ever did, right? And bands like Return to Forever and all of those amazing fusion bands were playing stuff in 1974, 75, 78 that were completely blowing away the prog rockers of the time. But I was a teenager into rock and roll. I wasn't into jazz and fusion music. That came later. Okay. For me and my generation of drummers, Neil Peart was it. He personified everything that was grand and glorious about rock drumming. And in fact, we went so far as to say that Neil Peart was the best drummer on planet Earth. Yes, as they said here, burdened by a bigger reputation, both positive and negative, than most of this list combined, Peart remains the paradigm for most paradiddlers. Okay. In other words, he was extremely influential. So this is 1986, right? And by 1988, 87, he had already gone to a more refined look and a pink drum set, which actually sounded amazing, that drum set. And this was another ad that I had back then that you could write away for the poster to Ludwig, and you'd send them a couple bucks to ship it back to you, and you'd get this amazing poster on your wall. But it was really this moment, getting back to the 90s, that was, in essence, the day that everything changed. And not only in retrospect for me and my generation of drummers, but possibly for music as well. And what am I talking about? I'm talking about the Buddy Rich Memorial Scholarship Concert of 1991, which was at the Ritz, which was formerly the Studio 54 on 57th Street in Manhattan. They turned it into the most amazing concert venue. That place changed my life in two ways. Not only did I see this concert, which I'll talk about, but 2 years before, which I guess primed me for being able to recognize the story that I'm about to tell you. I saw the most influential concert I ever saw in my life. It was Leeway, this band called Leeway, and they opened up for a band called Gwar, Gwar. Now, Gwar disgusted me. I wasn't down with Gwar. But Leeway was by far the most electrifying band with the most electrifying frontman that I had ever seen in my life. And the dual Marshall JCM 800s with AJ Novello and Mike Gibbons on stage with their synchronized fast guitars, right? And Pokey on drums had this very tight sound. He was using beautiful set of Sonar drums. The bass player didn't even know who he was, couldn't hear him. But then this amazing frontman, Eddie Sutton, who right now has cancer, and I really hope that the guy gets through it, because he's a musical legend that does not get enough recognition. But we were at the Ritz in 1991 to see this Buddy Rich Memorial Scholarship Concert. And what these concerts was the famous drummers of the day, the biggest names of the day, playing drums, playing jazz tunes on stage in these small venues, which was unheard of in those days. Neil Peart at the Ritz. Oh my God, we got to go see this. So my father, actually, who never really supported any of my artistic endeavors, I have to just be honest, he was only concerned with my academics and couldn't have cared less about anything else in my life, who I was as a person. Of course, I don't want to sit here and badmouth my father, because it ain't like that. That's just the reality. Probably for a lot of us of that generation, we didn't have very involved parents in our artistic lives. Okay. But he bought tickets for me for this concert, and he came with me. And I remember we were sitting in the balcony seats, first row. It was amazing. And everybody here was a Neil Peart fan. Everybody had the mullets. Everybody had their Rush t-shirts on, including myself. And everybody was there to see their hero do what? Blow all the other drummers away. He was playing that night on stage with Omar Hakim, Steve Smith from Journey, William Calhoun from Living Colour, Marvin Smitty Smith, who was a jazz fusion player at the time, very technically adept person. And it didn't matter. These guys didn't exist to all of us in the crowd. It was Neil Peart all the way. And of course, this is a picture of him playing that night. And he's playing, as you can see, a much smaller drum set than we as Rush fans were used to. And then something happened. He got on stage and he absolutely blew it. He sounded like an amateur. He was out of his depth, completely out of his league, sounding wooden, doing the same drum solo that he had done for 20 years. Even he later on talked about how disastrous this night was. But it wasn't until the end of the show that really everything changed, and I believe had a major cultural impact. He did a drum duet with Marvin Smitty Smith. Now, if you try to find footage of this and from the old videos, it's actually not there. And the reason why, I think, is because even the people who recognize put this together recognize that Neil Peart got his ass handed to him by Marvin Smitty Smith. It was a joke. Peart was up there doing his old 1970s cowbell stuff, his essentially very wooden and very, technically correct, but somewhat soulless playing. And he had this guy, Smitty Smith, next to him, just absolutely blowing him away with the latest techniques, the fast rolls, the unbelievable cymbal work. And it was not even a contest. Even I, who worshipped the ground that Peart walked on, knew that he had gotten blown away. And it's funny because then there was all these urban legends about Neil Peart. The next day was at Hard Rock Cafe, and the word around the town was that he was so pissed off at his performance that he snapped at a waiter, and that story went out around New York for quite a few years. But it caused actually Neil Peart to go back to the woodshed. He was so embarrassed by this performance of his that he completely then changed his style. He got a teacher, he started doing traditional grip, and what it did was it caused him to lose his identity and what made him so great in the first place. So Peart went through an identity crisis. And because Peart went through an identity crisis, we as fans, the collective Rush fans, and we were big back in the 80s, we started to question everything. And a lot of us ended up listening to newer music, right? This was the night that changed musical history. Rush no longer was cool anymore. All the new bands were coming in. The Beastie Boys were actually becoming more influential. So I just wanted to share that story because not too many people were at this concert, and very few people, only the people who were there, saw that drum battle. And in fact, I even had an argument about it online. People love to argue with me online. And I wrote, I was there that night. Tons of Rush fans were there. 1991 was a very weird time in music, and Rush were being overshadowed by other bands at this point. The feeling in the audience was strange. It was like we Peart fans were still trying to hold on to the notion that Peart was the best in the world. Meanwhile, to anybody who was there witnessing it, it was clear was not at his best that night, and later got smoked by another drummer. I couldn't remember if it was Calhoun or Smitty Smith in a drum duel. In retrospect, this was a major night in the history of rock music. It was the moment when the torch was passed and Peart officially became old. I never thought the same about Peart after that night, and I have a feeling he didn't either. I truly believe that the experience he had there prodded him to go back to the woodshed. And of course, the fact that you can't remember the name of the drummer that smoked him says everything. Tells me Peart was the best. Now, Enzo Chiapet, I got to give you credit. You are holding a flame out of the 80s when Peart was the best drummer in the world. And because I'm not into arguing, I just wrote, it was Marvin Smitty Smith. Thanks for reminding me about this. So that's my little Neil Peart story. Let's get back to the what made Grand Royal so great. Now, in Grand Royal magazine, one of the beautiful things is that they did not treat you like a moron. They didn't talk down to you. They assumed that you had an education, an intellect. And one of the articles that actually really exemplifies that is Atari Teenage Workshop, building your own Atari games. So this was within a magazine that had Dolomite on one side, had demolition derbies on the other, had articles about Polaroid land cameras and Moog synthesizers. And here they are teaching you how to build your own Atari games and how to program them and everything. And we're not going to go through this, but take a look at the 4 sample lines from the 1200 odd lines that make up the game Combat. Makes sense? It's tedium at its worst. You're dealing with the computer at such a fundamental level that it's difficult to abstract out. Okay, so this was and people are still doing this to this day. Actually, they're still like making 8-bit video games. A lot of people think is cool now and new now, we were doing it in the 90s, guys. This was a classic article, and we're not going to read it. We're going to do deep dives on 3 articles a little later. But if you want one of the funniest reads you will ever have in your life, this is an article by Mike Watt. Now, I'm not quite sure who he is. I think he was a drummer of some band, about his knees, right? About all the trials and tribulations of his knees. My knees, my knees. Folks want to hear about my knees? Thoughts of my knees careen through my head, bumping and pushing the other realms of my brain into paranoid contortions, twisted and misshapen, relieving the pain and agony over and over, a nightmare overbearing me. I find myself balanced atop my 2 shins with teetering fulcrums joining them to my thigh bones, tiny rubber band-like ligaments barely keeping rein on the dreaded kneecaps, which hanker to bolt and dislocate. The dread, oh, the dread, the worry, the fear, my knees. And this whole article is about the history of his knees, right? Within a magazine that had Dolomite, Lee Scratch Perry, articles about female bands having to go to the bathroom. I mean, all sorts of weird, fun stuff like that. And of course, we cannot forget the fact that they had a paean, a history, what would be the word? A swan song, a love story too. The White Fro. Okay. And again, this was a magazine that didn't treat you like an idiot, and it still gave you scholarly articles on things like the Jew fro, right? Afros are regular and Spanish fros are common, but take that same fro and put it on someone who's white, and that's straight up special. The phenomenon known as the white fro, or more colloquially, the Jew fro, not in any defamational way, but as a reflection of cultural pride, has a lineage spanning over time, embedded deep in the roots of history. This is a story for those who ask, where did mine come from? Or why can't I have one? It's all had to start somewhere, and that somewhere is at the start. And of course, we see all these cultural icons here, Cotter, right? I don't know, but Simon and Garfunkel, Stephen Wright, Harpo Marx, Gilda Radner, even the dude from the Beastie Boys right here, Ad Rock, right? And this was an article dedicated to the history of the Jew fro. And of course, as a Son of Sam researcher, a former Son of Sam researcher, I cannot help but mention that they left off one very, very big person in this article. And who was that? Yes, Disco Dave Berkowitz, who had perhaps the best example of the Jew fro possible. And why do we call him Disco Dave? Well, you can look into my vast archive of videos, over 300 videos at this point, all talking about Son of Sam. And you can look up a video where I interviewed DJ Tony Amato from 1976. He was the DJ of the Peachtree Disco in New Rochelle, which was a very famous disco in the Son of Sam story. And he told us straight up that Disco Dave Berkowitz came before the first shooting of Donna Loria, and Donna Loria was at the Peachtrees the night of her shooting. That for the weeks prior to that shooting, David Berkowitz was not only witnessed in the Peachtree discos on numerous occasions, but came up to him and actually introduced himself, shook his hand, talked to him and everything, was interested in the DJ gear. So this is, of course, how we got the moniker Disco Dave Berkowitz, the Lord of Life. And so all that's on my website, Son of Sam Truth, which is the same channel that you're watching this on. And of course, here, Survival of the Fattest, right? So this is an article that's just as scholarly as the article about the Jew fro, about the white fro. Okay. Now, don't forget, I'm Generation X. I don't get offended. Being offended is not part of my DNA. So I can use the word Jew fro, and I'm not meaning it negatively. I get no offense, even though I'm half Jewish. I was bar mitzvahed. Okay. But here we have Survival of the Fattest, which is an exploration into the sounds and science and history of the synthesizer. So a lot of people are obsessed with synthesizers today. If you look up YouTube, it's all these dweebs who are showing off their latest modular system. And as I said before in the intro, none of these guys are actually making music with it. They're just jerking each other off, showing their latest gear that they can review on YouTube. That's basically where music is nowadays for me. People making demo tapes of effect pedals, demos of their guitars, new demos of their unboxing of their synthesizers. A bunch of dweebs. Okay. But back then, the dweebs who were into this stuff, myself included, we sought these instruments out in all the pawn shops of America. And much like the Beastie Boys did, we used them to make music. So of course, Bob Moog, the famous guy, he went to my high school, Bronx Science. And weirdly enough, my mom, when she was in college, she was friends with the Moogs because they lived upstate where she went to college. And she not only was friends with the Moogs, but she was friends with, she knew and had seen every day in a cafe Rod Serling from Twilight Zone. So that's my mom's generation. She's a little older than she had me at 35. So she was already quite old when she had me. So she goes back to the 50s and 60s rather than the 70s. So this was an amazing article. We're not going to go into it. And this I found very interesting too, because this was an incredibly insightful article into Wendy Carlos, who did a very seminal and influential album called Switched on Bach. It introduced America to the sound of the synthesizer in the late 60s. And it was a best-selling album. You'd never know about it by the 90s if it wasn't for magazines like Grand Royal bringing this stuff back. Now, the reason why I found this so incredibly interesting was because Wendy Carlos was actually William Carlos. This was I guess you would call it a transgender now. But this is one difference between the 90s and our generation today. If you read an article about Wendy Carlos today, right? If someone was to write it, the first 3 paragraphs would be an homage to her bravery for being a transgender and that generation of time. And it would all be about her penis. Okay. Quite frankly, it would all be about her pecker, her new estrogen stuff, about how heroic this person is, and so on and so forth. If you look at this article to oppose what we're talking about, it talks nothing about that. Okay, Switched on Bach. It actually starts about the first fully synthesized album, simultaneously leveled the classical and pop music markets and established Wendy Carlos as the leader in electronic synthesis. Okay, yet there is another story to tell, and they retain. So again, this other story wasn't about her being transgender. It never comes up in the article. So as Donna Tripp said, it didn't matter. We weren't obsessed with identity politics back then. Liberals were fucking cool back then. We were the coolest people out there. We were interested in freedom and libertarian principles. Okay. And we're going to see when we go do a deep dive into 3 specific articles, we're going to really get a very much more stark example of that. This was a great article about the New England Synth Museum, right? The Sanford and Son of Synthesizer Storage by Herschel Gare. And this article is actually extremely special. It talks about these 2 guys who found in the Yellow Pages that there was a synth museum somewhere in Massachusetts, right? So they totally freaked out. They were like, this is going to be the best thing. We got to go up there. Remember, this was the age before the internet. You actually had to live life back then. You saw something there. You were like, oh, wow, I got to go up there. I got to see it and check it out. Anyway, they get up there and it's this dude who's like half sick with the flu. He's some dweeb who just collects synthesizers in his parents' attic and basement. He had amazing synthesizers, but they're all sitting around his apartment broken. So this article not only is about the synthesizers, but it's about this incredibly interesting person who knows whether he's even alive anymore, right? And it's a very dense article about not only the equipment, but about this very interesting human being. Again, something that could only happen in the ethos of the 90s, right? Here's an article about the history of Adidas shoes, right? Who would think that this was something interesting? But let me tell you, the person who wrote this, Don Field, right? Two brothers with a foot fetish. Perfect way to start this article. My brother and I first found out about Adidas 24 years ago, about hearing a rumor about these superior German track shoes that somehow greatly increased any person's athletic performance. But of course, the Beastie Boys were into Adidas because of the connection to hip hop. And of course, that connection to hip hop was Run DMC, right? With their shell top Adidas. In fact, they even have a song, My Adidas, standing on 25th Street, funky fresh and yes, co on my feet. I still remember the lines from every one of these. Okay. So so that's what caused that. And of course, this article is amazing for those who are interested in the history of Adidas shoes. And one of the beautiful things about magazines like this is that they didn't play to your inherent biases. They challenged the way you thought. They exposed you to things that you never would have otherwise been exposed to, and perhaps changed many people's lives and maybe even changed the culture because somebody was influenced by one of these things and took that to a unbelievable level. I don't know. I've never followed that. I've never studied those who read this magazine and where they ended up. But this is to say that this magazine did not treat you like a fool, even though the articles were fun. They even had an article on the Mad Max bikes of the Lower East Side about these two guys who came from Puerto Rico and they lived on the Lower East Side, and they had these amazingly hooked up bikes, right? With CBs on them, radios, right? They weren't powered by engines or anything. They were they were bikes that you still pedaled by hand, right? It is my dream, a dream that I have had ever since I was a kid. I have always dreamed of skulls. I mean, where would you get this? Where would you get an article like this other than in Grand Royal Magazine? And of course, we see the the amazing period piece advertisements, LP and CD, 210 East 49th Street. Notice how there's no web page here. Okay. Bathe on that for a second while I drink water. So let's take a little bit of a deeper dive, shall we? Because I've been showing you a smattering of these articles and how amazing they were and how eclectic they were and how they forced us to think and how they really exemplified the ethos of the 90s, where there was this cross-cultural ferment of artistic forms all influencing one another, and classical liberals being cool and having a libertarian mindset before the age of mass manufactured crisis came in that turned so many people into, well, complete conformists, loving the system, begging please to get their next shot of this, their next biopharma medical product of that. Okay. It's ridiculous what we've become. And we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into that here and talk about those social forces that are in that are in play. Well, this is one that really, really exemplifies what I'm talking about. Okay. This article on this guy, Aaron Burr, Real American Badasses. Now, remember, this was a magazine that was aimed mainly towards cool left wingers, right? People who were into the arts, people who were into freedom, people who were into all sorts of different philosophies and political beliefs, people who were against the man, in a sense. Okay. So this talks about Aaron Burr, and of course, I'm going to relate this to the modern world in a few minutes. Every morning, he'd wake up, go into the backyard, and pump lead into every major organ of a wooden target carved to resemble a man. He was probably the only vice president to go on the lam for murder while holding office. He hung out with the world's greatest minds, spoke 9 languages fluently with no accent, got kicked out of every country in Europe, and tried to invade New Orleans with his own private army. Far from suffering for his indiscretions, he died rich, old, and happy. He was Aaron Burr. So this article goes on to talk about the life of Aaron Burr. Now, for those of you who don't remember, Aaron Burr was an old politician from the 80s. from the 1700s, early 1800s. He was a contemporary of all the founding fathers of the United States. And of course, it said here, he also became known as the best lawyer in New York. He played politics and won a bunch of offices like governor and senator. The famous Tammany Hall political machine was organized by Burr, who started buying all 1,000 members pints of beer and shots of rum every week. Eventually, he got really tricky and ended up Thomas Jefferson's vice president. So we're talking about a major U.S. politician who, right, he was widely regarded as a man of no integrity, right? A comment made public by his archenemy, Alexander Hamilton, who had been fucking with him since the Revolutionary War. Okay, excited for any excuse to blow Hamilton away, Burr challenged him to a duel. Hamilton, no dummy, tried to squeak out of the duel with the master shot, but Burr left Hamilton no way to get out and save face. They met on a New Jersey bluff overlooking the Hudson River, and of course, this article then goes on to talk about how Aaron Burr killed Alexander Hamilton, and then the next page, of course, talks about just what a badass he is. Aaron Burr became obsessed with invading Mexico and starting his own country, which he would rule as King Aaron the First. First, he tried to get Jefferson to make him governor of the newly purchased Louisiana Territory. Jefferson knew what a fruitcake he was and said no. But again, even though it's calling him a fruitcake here, there's a respect for this guy. They called him an American badass, that he was someone that we should actually look at and admire. Right now, one thing that I want to contrast that to, of course, is the horrific and horrible play called Hamilton, of course, started by this fucking dweeb right here. Okay, Lin-Manuel Miranda. And And this is the perfect example, of course, of the difference between 90s ethos, 90s culture, and today. Now, remember, here's a liberal magazine, right? Totally talking about the badass Aaron Burr, right? And Hamilton, the play is all about how Aaron Burr was terrible and Hamilton was great. Okay. So, of course, that shows you right there the same left wing who in the 90s was cool, was reading these articles on Burr, right? Even his worst enemies conceded that he was a brilliant man, but fuck it. Would you rather be president for 4 years or emperor for life? He couldn't settle for president, Burr. He wanted Aaron the First and very nearly got it. All of his schemes, however insane, were planned out perfectly well and stood a good chance of working if ever realized. Dream little, gain little. Dream big and they brand you a traitor. Maybe he was a traitor that is to everyone but himself, Aaron Burr, American badass. Okay, so this article treated this guy Burr very fairly, whereas this dweeb right here turned him into a major enemy. Now, I have something against this guy, okay? I really do. And the reason why is because in about 4 or 5 years ago, we had a house guest who came and stayed with us with their 16-year-old daughter. And I'll never forget, she was into musical theater, which right there is the worst thing imaginable. Musical theater is horrible, okay? I think we can all agree on that. And so she was all about, oh, Lin Miranda, Hamilton, it's the best thing on the planet Earth. Do you want to hear some of it? And I I went into the bedroom and I made my girlfriend actually stayed out there and listened to it. I knew that I wasn't going to be able to keep my mouth shut, and she's much more diplomatic and political than I am. So all of a sudden I hear the play being pressed on the CD counter, and what comes out is a series of guttural honks, squeaks, bleedings, the absolute gayest shit I've ever heard in my life. Horrific, terrible stuff. And of course, I was laughing in the bedroom because all of a sudden I hear my girlfriend say, "That's really good. I like it." She had to do it. But it's funny because some people do know the truth about this dweeb, right? There's something revealing in the disjunction between Hamilton's popularity in the world of online media and Hamilton's popularity in the world of actual human persons. After all, here we have a cultural product whose appeal essentially consists of a broad coalition of the worst people in America. New York Times writers, 15-year-olds who aspire to answer the phone in Chuck Schumer's office, people who want to get into steampunk but have a copper sensibility, and wonks. Yet, because a large fraction of these people are elite tastemakers, Hamilton becomes a topic of disproportionate interest, discussed at unendurable length in the New Yorker and Slate and the New York Times Magazine, yet totally inaccessible to anyone besides the writers and members of their close social networks. So this gets back into what I wanted to say about the difference between American culture in the 1990s that would take the enemy of this Lin Miranda's horrific play called Hamilton and actually turn him into a hero for the left. And then just almost 30 years later, not even, well, maybe even 20 years later, right? It totally gets changed and turned around. All of a sudden, the left becomes the lovers of Alexander Hamilton, who quite frankly was a slave owner, one of really just not a good guy. Okay. I mean, let's be honest here. He loved his slaves. No matter what he talked about getting rid of slavery, he always had slaves and he loved his slaves. But of course, it makes sense when you think about it, because even in the 90s, the tastemakers were cool. People like the Beastie Boys, people who were influencing leftist politics and culture, right? We had the space and the ability to revel in the badassery of an Aaron Burr. Now you have this dweeb here talking about Hamilton all the time being the greatest person. And let me tell you something. I'd walk around some places with gardening at these left-wing buildings that I used to garden at, and there'd be people, oh, Lin Miranda, an absolute genius. And I'd be like, I got more talent in my left nut than this guy has. And of course, he does get savaged by the left, interestingly enough. But of course, these are underground, like these aren't culturally relevant pieces here that everyone's reading, right? Why Hamilton is the most right-wing musical on Broadway. In contrast, The Haunting of Lin-Manuel Miranda, which debuted at the Nuyorican Poets Cafe and was published by Archer, reframes Hamilton's origin story by emphasizing the years he spent working for a slave firm in St. Croix. True leftists, which still existed, like myself and the people who wrote The Haunting of Lin-Manuel Miranda, knew what was up with this guy. This guy is a child of privilege. Right. I'll show you an article. His father was heavily connected into Democrat politics. Is the only reason he made it. OK. After immigrating to the U.S., this is Hamilton now, the guy that the leftists are all celebrating as the savior of the earth, or because a black dude is now playing him on Broadway, assuaging them, of course, of their own inherent guilt and also their own inherent racism, because the modern left is actually the most racist people on planet Earth. He settled in New York and married Eliza Schuyler, who came from a family of high society, slave-owning New Yorkers. While Hamilton was a member of the Manumission Society, a group of do-gooding abolitionists, reminds me of modern leftists and their eco stuff, he never ceased enslaving people himself, a fact which seems to trip up many historians and fans of the musical alike. And of course, here we go. Like, here's the left-wing love story of Hamilton. Oh, Hamilton is nominally about the founding of America, written by a man who in many ways personifies the most idealized version of the American dream. Miranda, a native New Yorker and son of Puerto Rican transplants, grew up in Washington Heights, tested into an elite prep school, wrote and staged a semi-autobiographical musical in the Heights while he was still in college, and saw that show become the toast of Broadway in 2007. Well, the reality is this dude was the son of one of the most corrupt political operatives in New York City. His father, Luis Miranda, here, right? An influential lobbyist with close ties to the city council speaker, Melissa Mark Viverito, failed to pay his nonprofit's workers tens of thousands of dollars in wages, using the money to cover an IRS debt. All right. So here's the reality of everything. Luis Miranda Jr. personally directed money that should have been used to pay employees at the nonprofit Audubon Partnership for Economic Development, which he chairs, to instead pay the IRS a $500,000 debt owed by a progressive Dominican group that hired both Miranda's wife and his independent lobbying firm. All right. So here we go. The modern left, totally corrupt, totally in bed with the New World Order evil beast system, right? Putting their sons out there, pretending that they're Puerto Rican transplants and grew up in Washington Heights. Yeah, he grew up in one of the nicest areas of that community, which is actually quite affluent. Okay. To then send out their children as agents of the current system to make people like Hamilton look good, slave owners look good, right? And to make us think that American badasses like Aaron Burr were bad. And this is a perfect example of why the 90s were so much cooler than they are than the modern era today. And if you think I'm done with this asshole, because I have a bone to pick with him, I still can't get that music out of my head, that horrific bleedings, the honkings that I heard that day. Well, here we go. Puerto Rico, beware. Okay. Lin-Manuel Miranda is revamping Puerto Rico's coffee industry. So here we go, where Miranda's coming off as some savior. Lin-Manuel and the Miranda family have announced that they are launching a 5-year, $1 million initiative to help revive Puerto Rico coffee and their farmer. But it's just not Miranda's that are part of this program, but also the Hispanic Federation, Nespresso, the Rockefeller Foundation, Starbucks, TechnoServe, and World Coffee Research. Puerto Rico, beware Manuel Miranda. Okay. He's not coming as an agent that wants to help you. He's coming as an agent of the Rockefellers. And woe betide anybody who takes any agricultural advice from the Rockefellers. Okay. So you got to watch out. And so the reason why I wanted to show this is because when I saw that Burr article in Grand Royal, it made me realize what a contrast to the modern age, where Hamilton now is the hero, and these agents of capital, right? These agents of the New World Order, the sons and daughters of these corrupt political operatives that are hooked up into extreme left-wing politics, like Lin Miranda, are put out there as some sort of savior to all of us. This is just more evil. What is it? Blackwashing of the New World Order. And as Lydia Lilly said, a wolf in sheep's clothing. Excuse me. Okay. All right. So that's a good contrast, I thought, and one that I wanted to bring up. Now, of course, here we have Bedtime for Gonzo, getting at a little bit more humor here. This was perhaps one of the funniest articles I've ever read. And again, a perfect example of people in the 90s who would get angry at each other, yell at each other. Sorry, let me get that up there. Curse at each other, absolutely savage each other, yet there was no canceling. The guy didn't get up and storm out because his sensibilities were offended, right? So here we go. Here's an article where a guy's interviewing Ted Nugent. And usually in these interviews, it's like, okay, hey, you just made the best album you ever made. Tell us about it. Well, that's a little different. What was up with the damn Yankees? They were pretty lame. Pretty lame. Do you ever see us live? Why would I want to see you live when the album was so lame? Oh, well, tell us more, Mr. Expert never saw us live, but we're lame. See, you're so typical. What's your middle name, Bob? Insulated? What's your middle name? I've got the night off. I'm going to sit home in a hot tub. Fuck you. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Damn Yankees. Fuck that. And that video with all the guys shooting at you, but no one hits you. Goddamn right. I'm the fucking Nuge, man. You're basically admitting that the damn Yankees were whacked by hooking back up with Derek St. Holmes and trying to cut your first decent solo LP in 20 years. Tell us about that. No, let's talk about the damn Yankees first. Okay, because everyone was disappointed with that. No, they weren't. Yes, all your old school fans were. We sold 4.5 million. That's a beautiful thing, my friend. Don't be jumping from edge to edge. The damn Yankees were genuine, a musical adventure. Oh, come on. It was a cash out. Get the fuck out of here. I jammed with Tommy Shaw. He played R&B, and so on and so forth. So Give me a second. I'm losing my voice. So this is a classic article, and I probably will put this up. Sorry, it was better here to read. Whoops, it was better to read it over here. Okay, and I'll probably put this up on Twitter because this is amazing. But it's funny because again, contrasting it to the modern era, I actually searched for this interview online and I found this right here. And notice how it is couched. Okay.
On any emotion that genuinely intrigues me, I'm out of it. I'm with
So
it.
this
I
is the
jump on
modern
it with both of
sensibility,
my
talking
fucking
about the, in fact, here's that,
sets of teeth cling to
here
the fucking
is
jugular.
that,
But then, like,
The point is, let's
here-
get to the bottom.
The second one came across as a cash-in on the first ballot MTV success. You know, secondary
MTV success? What MTV success? They didn't play any of our shit. They played a little bit of high enough.
A little bit of high enough.
A little bit of high enough.
That was like, microwave rotation.
Get the fuck out of here.
Was
Was it?
Come on, yeah.
Well, first of all, welcome to the real world. You know how many times I've watched MTV? Once in my fucking life.
You got to be on top of this thing.
I don't have. You know what I'm on top of? I'm on top of a real America
Okay, now what
with
are you
working
on top
hard,
of?
playing hard, white motherfucking shit kickers who are independent and get up in the morning and go.
Are there any black
Show me one. Show me one. Show me one.
There's one named Russell Simmons.
They never heard of him.
He's head of Def Jam Records. He was there that day that you cut the video with the Don, and apparently my sources tell me you told him that you're a bigger nigger than he'll ever be.
That's exactly what I said.
Now, what did you mean by that?
I meant that I've got soul, that I don't resort to fucking electronic drum beats, and I listen to James Brown and Wilson Pickett and Sam and Dave. You with me?
Yeah, no,
Those are niggers. Those are fucking spirited,
Now tell me about
genuine
your days with
African
George
American.
Clinton back in the days in Detroit.
I
Tell me
never
about
met-
those
I
things.
never
You
met
met
George.
fucking-
So again, you could look this up yourself, and I don't want to get struck by YouTube, of course, but the point is here that people back then were freaking cool. This guy wasn't being racist here. He was actually being extremely deferential to black artists. It's just that it was a different sensibility back then. He wasn't using those terms in a negative way, but we can see here how it's couched by this lame ass person on YouTube, right? Ted Nugent is a racist asshole. And the guy only has 66 subscribers, so luckily nobody really gives a crap about him. But again, this was funny. It was humorous. The guy doing the interviewing did not worry too much that Ted Nugent was using this language. It was just all fun. People could relax and relate to each other. So I just wanted to show that again as a as an amazing example of how different this time period was. So if anybody wants to call in, you're perfectly welcome to now. Tell us your stories about the 90s and tell us what you think about Grand Royal Magazine so far as we continue on. So of course, here's a grit. So now we're having a little bit more humor. Mulling over the mullet, an essay on tonsorial taste by the editors of Grand Royal. So again, much like the white afro, they did a whole study on the mullet. Okay. And of course, Geddy Lee is right here. Where's Geddy? Geddy right here, right? So even though I was the hugest Rush fan, it didn't matter that Geddy Lee was being made fun of. We were just having a fun time, right? Joey Buttafuoco, Mike Bolton, Tico Torres, even Ice-T had a mullet, right? All these fun people here. So this is a great article, and we're not going to read the whole thing. Give me a second here. Sorry. But I wanted to show you one excerpt from an article. From the article, I was a 20-something mullet head for a day by Michael Diamond, who of course is Mike D from the Beastie Boys, and this is hilarious. He goes through a day. So let's go. He gets a mullet, and then he walks around L.A. with it, seeing how people would react. And it was so funny, right? 1 p.m., pull up to Musicians Institute of Technology, aka Mullet Institute of Technology, just as classes are letting out. With gig bag in tow, I muster the courage to mingle with students and initiate conversation by asking how the school is. Mullet number one asks me what style of guitar I enjoy playing. I respond, rocks, riffs, licks, while looking at the ground. Then I ask if the school is very expensive, and he confirms that it's expensive, but I'm doing it all on loans. I'm paying for it later. And of course, this is a great the poor Mike D having just have been rejected by these three mullet wearing musicians from the 90s. And of course, this is the progenitor of the dweebs of today doing their YouTube videos of unboxing their latest synthesizer or showing off their latest effect pedal that they'll never make music with, right? This is probably the same people, right? So this was a magazine that was able to make fun of modern culture, to have fun with these things, to not get offended. But it was also actually an extremely serious magazine as well. Why? Well, because it had articles like this: Tinker, Tailor, Stoner, Spy, Dr. Timothy Leary, PhD, CIA. Okay. Now, there's a whole genre right now of people online doing thinking that they just discovered this material for the first time, that they're the first people to ever talk about Timothy Leary was in the CIA. He was involved with the MK Ultra, right? He was involved with all of these people. We're just learning about this for the first time. No, cool left wingers in the 90s, right? Cool classical liberals of the 90s were actually talking about this kind of stuff in the pages of Grand Royal magazine, which not only had articles on mullets, but in the same pages had very scholarly articles about how Timothy Leary was a CIA agent. Okay. And when you think about it from that perspective, it changes a lot of the cultural history of the 60s. Now, in the 90s, authors like Dave McGowan, Program to Kill were all coming out. And so there was this knowledge going around. But again, like I said, people think nowadays that this is all new stuff, new and information. One of the reasons why I was so radicalized in the 90s and became the libertarian that I later became was because I read articles like this, and I knew about articles like this, right? Gary Webb's exposés in the mid 90s about how the CIA was bringing crack cocaine into LA. And it was part of the whole Nicaragua, Iran Contra deals that what's his face was Oliver North and all those people were involved with. Reagan, Bush, right? Clinton, right? It didn't matter who it was. We just named the guilty parties back then. And of course, this dude was later found dead with 2 gunshot wounds in his head, and they said it was a suicide. That's a whole other story. Maybe Scott, if you're still in the chat, this would make a good show. Gary Webb and his articles for the San Jose Mercury News. But getting back to this article, it is a cavalcade of information, and let's take a look a little bit more at some of it. September 1942, the Office of Strategic Services, wartime precursor to the CIA, begins search for a drug that will force subjects of interrogation to reveal secrets. Project director Dr. Stanley Lovell will recall that such a truth drug is considered fantastic by the realists, unethical by the moralists, and downright ludicrous by the physicians. But Lovell goes ahead and tests mescalines, barbiturates, scopolamine, benzodrine, cannabis indica. The best results are obtained with indica. A few minutes after administration, subjects becomes relaxed and thoughts flow with considerable freedom. And that's very true, of course. But then it goes through the whole history of the use of CIA. Late 1950, Cord Meyer joins the CIA and put it in charge of International Relations Division. This purpose is to covertly encourage, finance, and infiltrate non-communist liberal institutions like labor unions, creative academic societies, and student groups. And then, of course, it talks about something that everybody thinks has just been discovered in the last 5 years, MK Ultra, which we were reading about back in the mid 90s in the pages of Grand Royal magazine, after the article about the Jufro, after the article of the now racist asshole Ted Nugent having the most unbelievably entertaining interview. And of course, after the articles about Aaron Burr, American Badass, which made Hamilton look like the dweeb slave owner that he was. And of course, who is now worshipped by the modern left because their agent of capital, Lin-Manuel Miranda, is out there telling them that Hamilton was amazing, right? Continuing the operation of working for the New World Order. These people now they're just sending their kids out to do it. Okay, so then it talks about 1960-61, how the Harvard Psychedelic Drug Research Center was formed, and Leary was part of that, and how LSD was CIA supplied, and all of this amazing history, which we were hearing about for the first time back then. Talks about James Jesus Angleton, Operation Chaos, which of course is the name of a book by Tom O'Neill about the Charles Manson murders, right? All of this amazing history, Mary Meyer, the JFK assassination is in all of this. And in the center of it all is, of course, is this Timothy Leary, who we never knew or thought of as a CIA agent. Okay, he even talks about Charles Manson up here, right? Leary's at the center of all this. So this is an amazing article as well. Just other excerpts of it. Here's the author accusing Leary of being in the CIA, and the and the author and the photographer snapped a picture right at that moment, and you can see, like, busted, right? So not only were these articles coming out, but these authors were actually going up to these people and getting right in their faces and talking about it with them, accusing them, telling them that we knew the truth. So again, another example of the ethos of the 90's, that really G. Gordon Liddy, right, hanging out with Timothy Leary. G. Gordon Liddy was supposed to be this Republican operative, straight-laced anti-drug dude. What's he doing hanging out here with Timothy Leary, right? And all that kind of stuff. So, and then it gets into Allen Ginsberg and this other guy, Zabbath Zvi, right? All of this amazing stuff that we never would have been exposed to back then was in the pages of this magazine. Well, my friends, that's pretty much all I have for you today. Is anybody interested in calling in? I didn't get a chance to really look at the chat because I was so into what I was doing today. But if anybody wants to call in while I'm giving my outro, that's totally cool. Hey, wait a second! I just realized within this article about the CIA and Timothy Leary, about the author is pictured here with his good friend Geddy Lee of Rush at Blue Jays spring training camp in Florida. Right? Mark and Geddy play Bill James Fantasy Baseball, a highly suspect organization itself, no doubt funded by the CIA. I mean, that's amazing stuff right there, right? So it just shows the ability to laugh at ourselves, to take things seriously while not taking things seriously, the irreverence, the respect for finding out truths, the respect for this whole eclectic cross-cultural ferment that we're talking about in the pages of this magazine. And really, I could think of no other magazine that really captured that ethos of the 90's, the freedom, the fun, the ability to not take ourselves too seriously while still talking about serious things, the ability to not get offended, the ability of the left to actually be into people like Aaron Burr and understand things like the CIA was involved with LSD and drugs, right? If you talk to your average liberal right now, not only are they loving Nazis in the Ukraine because they love this war, but they also love the biopharma medical tyranny that's being formed all around us. In fact, they think that they're fighting a battle on Iwo Jima. They think that they're the Iwo Jima guys putting the with their masks and their shots. They think that they're the ones on the hill of Iwo Jima putting that American flag down, right? These people love war. They love censorship. They love canceling people. They hate freedom of expression. Oftentimes the same people who were reading the magazine Grand Royal back in the 90's are the same people today who are the agents of all of these things that we as freedom lovers hate. So this is a great example about how things can really devolve in 30 years and how in my case, the passage of time, the 30 years between when I first started reading these articles and now having lived that time period, having observed the world around me and having found myself in a very specific spot in 2022, where my entire existence was wiped out by these cancel culture freaks. My jobs were taken away. I was fired from all sorts of work because of my beliefs, right? By the same people who call themselves freedom-loving liberals. So we have a lot to answer for. We have a lot to think about in this culture of ours. If you do consider yourself a leftist and you got offended at anything that I said today, well, then you're not truly a leftist. You're a cancel culturist. And really, the true people who are into this stuff are the libertarians of today, people who would be considered far right. Okay, that's how things have changed. So, all right, guys. Well, no one's calling in, and I think that we have said all we need to say. Just real quick, I want to just quickly, in case you like this and you don't know who I am because you're seeing this for the first time, I just want to share with you guys my Twitter page. So, what you can do to stay abreast of all that I'm doing is go to my Twitter page. I'm putting in the chat right here. Please follow me there. That's where I do all my advertising. And I have a great show coming up next week, which I wanted to just hip you to. This is, of course, back to true crime. We are doing a very big deep dive into Nikolai Aman and the murder of Alfred Hunt Howell. And of course, in this thumbnail, you can see the house in which Alfred Hunt Howell was murdered. This happened in my neighborhood. And it was allegedly, and I say allegedly because reading these police files, I'm starting to get some spidey senses action happening. It was allegedly committed by this gentleman over here, Nikolai Aman, who was in my 5th grade class and who I was pretty good friends with actually as a child. And this is me. And so here we are full circle 30 something years later. And so we'll be starting that next week. So that's back to the true crime aspect of my life. But I really wanted to branch out today and start trying to talk a little bit more about culture, about sociology, about politics, and also, though, mainly to really give a love story, a paean, a tribute to a decade called the 90s, where, quite frankly, people were cool and we knew how to have fun. And if there's one thing a piece of advice I can give to the modern youth is analog your life a little bit more, right? De-digitize, connect with those around you. I know it's very difficult now because we're all addicted to these things. Try to make things hard to seek out rather than easy. Try to do research into things that you might not think you're interested in. You may just find that it changes your life and changes your life for the better. All right, guys. Well, with that, I think we will say goodbye. And thank you so much for this first foray, for joining me on this first foray into a new topic for me. And hopefully, we will see you at the next live stream. Take care, everybody. Oh, wait. No, we're not going to go with that. All right, guys. Take care, guys.